Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. Good to see you. So let's return again to Master Keizan's collection of Zen stories, the Zen lineage according to the dominant Zen tradition. And good news also that our other teachers and practice leaders are going to start mixing in stories of the great Zen women. So we'll get a little broader story than just this list of guys. But it's both are important, I think. It's good to know how Zen has told its own story, even as we expand that story. So coming soon on that. A little more also about how Keizan was supported by women. This is from the scholar William Bodeford. Keizan's most important supporter, most important patron, was a woman, Lady Taira Sonin. In 1212, she and her husband donated land to what eventually became Keizan's main temple, Tokokusan Yokoji, usually gets called Yokoji, first part's the mountain name. And Sonin eventually became a nun with her own chapel. That seems like a mistake. It must have been 1312 because Keizan wasn't alive, so anyway. So an important woman donor who became a nun. And Keizan compared the closeness of their relationship to a magnet and a steel. They were connected. And interestingly, Keizan's dependence on a female patron was not at all unusual. When Dogen founded his first temple, Koshoji, Fukuoka near Kyoto, an aristic woman named Shogaku donated the lecture hall. And Dogen taught a number of laywomen and nuns, including Keizan's grandmother, Myochi. And other Soto monks who studied with Keizan as well as his disciples founded temples that were also sponsored by women's patrons. In fact, women outnumber men by a significant margin in the records of early donations and support preserved at Tokokusan Yokoji. And 15th and 16th century records of Soto funeral sermons, so a couple hundred years later, so this kept going, similarly reveal that the vast majority of lay funerals conducted by rural Zen teachers were for women. So clearly, without the support and religious devotion of countless women, Japanese Zen institutions could never have succeeded on such a wide scale. Yet today, we only know the names of a few of these vital female patrons. None of their biographies have survived. And scholars don't usually say none unless they really mean it, None have survived. Keizan's descriptions of Sonin, his grandmother, and his mother therefore provide rare glimpses into the essential role women played in the propagation of Buddhism in Japan. And I was reading that Keizan just wrote a lot, he just wrote stuff down. But he didn't really organize it into books, except for this one, a long essay on Zazen, and one other one. So they have, and the writings of the great masters after they pass become sacred objects in themselves, So then this stuff got sort of spread around at different temples, put on altars and in secret drawers behind altars where you don't even know it's there, but it's there, So scholars have the unenviable task of trying to find it all and weave it back together and figure out. I guess it's their job, they like it, And we also know from other writings that Keizan's support from women wasn't just financial. His writings suggest that he really listened to the women in his life. His mother, his grandmother, and his patron and student Sonin we just heard about. That they gave him advice and he took their advice and they collaborated. So I thought you'd want to know that. I didn't know that part about the patrons. That's new to me. So here's the third story of his book on the ancestors. And this chapter is really near and dear to my heart. Here's the opening case. The second ancestor, Venerable Ananda, asked Venerable Kashyapa, "Brother, apart from the world-honored one's transmission of the Kashaya of gold brocade, what is it that was transmitted separately?" Kashyapa called, "Ananda." Ananda answered, "Yes." Kashyapa said, "Topple the flagpole in front of the gate." Ananda greatly awakened. So this is the pithy story, the koan story that's in the center of this transmission, and there is one for every transmission. And of course we know in actual historic dimensions in everyday life, how could every awakening experience have one pithy little story that you could say in a couple sentences, right? It doesn't seem quite possible, but it's a wonderful religious mythology, very powerful for us, and very, very helpful actually. So Ananda asked Kashyapa, I don't know if they were even like formally teacher or student actually. They had practiced together for 30, 40 years by this time. So Ananda asked Kashyapa, and remember Kashyapa was last week the one who responded to the Buddha's flower and wink. Keizan thought the wink was the really important part. So he asked Kashyapa, "Brother, apart from the world-honored one's transmission of the Kashaya of gold brocade, what was it that was transmitted?" Kashyapa called to him, "Ananda." Ananda answered, "Yes." Kashyapa said, "Topple the flagpole in front of the gate." And Ananda greatly awakened. So this is a story about Ananda, the Buddha's loyal attendant and biological cousin. These days also a folder in Google Drive that's important to us. But the reason why I chose that name for the folder in Google Drive is Ananda's great quality was he kept track of everything. He remembered everything. And I've always loved Ananda because of his role in the family drama of Buddhism, the stories of early Buddhism. He's basically the really smart younger brother who just doesn't quite get it. He's incredibly smart, incredibly talented, incredibly devoted, never gives up, very eager, you know. Kind of has a dog, I think that's kind of like a dog-like quality. You know? But he just like doesn't fully get it and doesn't understand why this is, you know. And I'm sure he didn't present like a needy person in life. I'm sure he presented like the dignified, deeply practicing monk that he was and is, Dogen would tell us. He's right here. So whatever feelings of disquiet he had were either very quiet in him or he just kept them quiet and kept at it. But at its root, his practice was characterized by a deep, unfulfilled yearning. A yearning. Can you relate to that? I need something. There's something. I don't know what it is. There's something. What does all this mean? What does it really mean? What is my life really about? And, you know, platitudes won't cut it, you know. Words probably won't cut it. But like I say, he worked hard, practiced hard. And he was most famous for his incredible memory. He was the Buddha's attendant and also coincidentally his biological cousin. And his other claim to fame was he was born at the moment of Buddha's awakening. Did you know that? Yeah, not a fun myth. So somehow his coming into being had to do with Buddha, his older cousin who became the Buddha awakening. It's quite a difference, I guess the generations must have been a little interleaved there. And so he sat next to the Buddha, just like Seishin was just helping me with the incense. He helped Buddha with the incense and preparing his seat and sat next to him for pretty much all of his talks. And Buddha gave a talk every day for 40 years, That's a lot of talks. And nothing was written down. It was all remembered, and so Ananda's role in the Sangha was he remembered it all. Imagine that, Our memories are so sabotaged by devices now, we could barely remember anything, When I can't copy paste it from one tab to the other, I'm kind of like screwed, All right? What was it again? Go back. Wow, okay, got it. Wow. But not that way at all. Deep connection to every word the Buddha said. Remember them all. And I had always heard it said that nothing was written down, but actually that turns out to be not exactly true. I did a little more research. There was a writing system. Pretty simple grammar, Probably not a huge vocabulary, but there's a writing system. And it was used by merchants for commerce. And so it was a little bit kind of lowbrow writing. We think of writing now as very highbrow, but actually writing was very lowbrow, very common, Kind of commercial. Speaking of which, what would the hippies have thought of these commercial products on the walls? Amazing. They never could have conceived that such a thing would be possible. One day a distorted version of your ideology will be produced in plastic in China and shipped all over the world. First they'd be like, what's plastic? What? Anyway, a little digression there. It's great. Anyway, so yeah, the merchants used writing and they had to keep track of stuff, right? But religious people and also the high-class people, the noble people didn't use writing. It was kind of below them, kind of gauche to learn how to write. So because of that, Buddhism was only an oral tradition for an unbelievably long time. The consensus is something like 400 to 500 years from when the Buddha said these things. If he in fact said them, like how can we be totally sure? We can't. To when it was written down. And as you probably know, the most famous collection of those written down teachings was produced right about the beginning of the Common Era in the Pali language of South India. And the surviving sets of those end up in Sri Lanka, the nation we call Sri Lanka now. But there are many other versions. That one's famous because we have a pretty complete version to this day. Other ones are more fragmentary. And anyway, if you read these sutras, these suttas, these old Buddhist teachings that were written down so much longer, 500 years, how did they keep it up, It was a real practice, obviously, right? The practice of recitation, the practice of listening. And, we might not have liked it, from our framework, I don't think there were small group discussions about their inner feelings in these monastic establishments. They wouldn't have had time for that, We're still working our way through Book 5, chanting and chanting and reciting and chanting, reciting night and day, And, to preserve it, but also to practice those practices. But anyway, all these teachings start with a stock phrase. And the stock phrase is, "Thus have I heard." So the I there is Ananda. At least, it's supposed to be. That's the conceit. There's plenty of these that scholars are pretty sure he wasn't present, but a lot of them he was, I think these stories are not disconnected from historic reality. This stuff did happen, probably. And when the Buddha died in the traditional sources, it became even more of a problem for Ananda that he still kind of didn't get it, hadn't fully awakened the way they talked about it. Problematic concept for us because it makes us kind of greedy for something, but he hadn't fully awakened. And he also had a big kind of screw up right before the Buddha died. I think I mentioned this to you before. It's pretty funny. Over the 40 years of the Buddha's teachings, in response to different little mishaps in the Sangha, they built up quite a long rule book. Hundreds of rules, some of them very specific, and some of them sound very odd to us today. Rules about food and where you sleep and stuff like that. No high beds, no garlic. And soon before he died, Buddha apparently told Ananda, it's permissible to release the minor rules. And Ananda said, oh God. But he never asked the Buddha which ones they were. And so after he died, the other monks were like, dude, I guess we're stuck with all of them. And then the Buddha, as I mentioned, it was the first chapter. I mentioned this a little bit, so it's worth repeating. It's a really fun part of our tradition of Buddhism. Buddha didn't name a successor, so Buddha in the early Buddhist writings, they don't fit Keizan's book exactly. He didn't name a successor in that story. But all of his close students got together and they were collectively his successors. And the first thing they wanted to do was get really clear, what were all the teachings, I was here for some of those, you were here for those ones. And so they wanted Ananda to tell them, but then they had a big problem. Because somehow they had a clear vision that the only people that should be in the room were the people who fully got it, People had this integration, this experience, this whatever it is, or isn't. And Ananda, in that story, is very, very upset. Imagine the crushing blow of this, You devoted your whole life to this thing. Your brothers and sisters all got it. You never did. And then the next phase of the whole project is starting, and they're like, sorry, we'll take notes. We'll email you the link. You don't get to be there. And so in that story, Ananda is crying. He's crying. So don't think that the monks were always unemotional or detached or something. They were emotional beings. And he's sobbing and he lies down to sleep the night before this important meeting to go through all the teachings. And as his head hits the pillow, so that's the traditional story, the earlier one. But here we have the Zen story, which is different from that. And in that it's very relational. It's Ananda and Kashyapa. Remember we met Kashyapa last week, as I said. Ananda, according to these stories, Ananda, even after, 30, I think maybe it was 35 or 40 years with the Buddha, he then spent 20 years with Kashyapa, who's the next ancestor in our version. And he asked him a question one day. I love these questions, they're a little funny sounding to us because of the language, but if you think about it, these kind of questions are incredibly vulnerable, are incredibly humble. Ananda is like the world's expert on Buddhist teachings, and he's hanging around, still trying to figure it out in the Zen version. What does it really mean? Teaching and helping and, doing the thing, being a monk. And 20 years in, he turns to Kashyapa and says, brother, what's the deal? Apart from the world honors one transmission of the Kashaya of gold brocade, what is it that was transmitted? So Kashaya is just the Sanskrit word for okesa. So the symbolism is at transmission you receive the robes and the bowl and the secret, of the thing. The ineffable transmission of the Dharma. It can't be seen in that way. So Ananda's like, yeah, I get the manifestation, I get the Kashaya. I was there, he gave you the Kashaya, gave you the robe. But what was it he really gave you, So to admit that, right? To be humble. So this is a good model for us. Just be really humble. We don't know what do you know? Do you know anything? I don't know anything, but I'm willing to learn. Sometimes it's hard, right? These guys had egos, for sure. We're defended. It doesn't even occur to us to ask. We're not supposed to ask or something, But he asks. And Kashyapa, as a wise Zen teacher, doesn't try to explain anything. Offers no words. Doesn't do any mysterious Zen gestures either. We thought of that later in China. He listens. He sees where Ananda is at, and he calls to him. He calls him forth. He calls his name, I imagine with a lot of strength, from the hara, right? Ananda! You're not yelling at him, but Ananda! And this just sinks into Ananda's bones, into his marrow. Everything changes. Everything shifts. And it's, in actuality, a tiny shift, like a shift too small to see, but it's the most important thing. It's also enormous. And in Ananda's seeing, he immediately can respond. Respond also from the depths of his Dharma heart. He says right back, yes! In the translation, they put yes with a question mark, but that's wrong. I'm going to change that. It's yes with an exclamation mark, or just a really solid period, Period, end of sentence, Yes. Yes, I understand now. Yes, I realize now I didn't have to worry about that for all those years. It's always been right here. It's not something extra, something you get from someone else, something you figure out, something somebody gives you like a gold star or something. It's right here. And it's everywhere. Like remember the Buddha's famous statement on his awakening, I and everybody, I and the whole world, I and all beings awaken. It's not about me. But we need these bodies and minds and hearts to embody it and make it real. So here's a play of two bodies making this real. And then Kashyapa confirms that, yes, we're done here with a metaphor. He says, topple the flagpole in front of the gate. So Keizan explains this refers to an old Indian custom. Probably, I haven't tried to look up the anthropology of this. That it being an oral culture, there was not like books circulating around, right? There were no chat rooms or anything like that, So one of the things that they did for entertainment and education, and keeping their minds going, was they had debates. They had public debates, usually one-on-one with everybody listening. And when you get to the place where the debate's going to be, the town square or something, if you're the debater, one of the two debaters, you would bring this flag, I suppose on a little staff or something, special flag that maybe it's your family's sort of crest or design, and you set that in the ground, and the other person would set theirs in the ground, or maybe on a flagpole, who knows, And then the loser of the debate would have to, somebody would knock over their flag. So it's kind of competitive thing. And there's some really famous debates actually in the history of Buddhism that told in retrospect, right, and given a lot of weight, where like it set the course of an entire branch of Buddhism for the rest of time, that so-and-so defeated so-and-so in debate, and the truth became clear, So interestingly and appropriately, if you think about it, Kashyapa doesn't say, lift up your flag and take down the other guy's flag, that part of you that's been stuck on yourself all these years. You've defeated that part of yourself. He said, knock it all down. Topple the flagpole, Let go of all of that. You don't need to be, it's such a clear metaphor even for us today, right? Staking your claim. You don't need to stake your claim on reality or truth or you or anything. Topple. And if this Ananda's realization only got deeper. What a relief. Imagine the relief of that, So, according to the Zen tradition, he was perhaps full-time monastic for 60 years before letting this happen, In case you're wondering when the good stuff comes. You better live a long time. And these wonderful myths, they also lived a really long time, probably like 5 times the actual historic life expectancy of the time, So a release from striving. I really relate to that too, don't you? I'm a striver. Are you a striver? It's got to do all this stuff to try to heal a little bit from striving. Maybe I strive some percentage less than before. I don't expect it's a big percentage. But a little is a lot, A little is a lot. So this story is really close to my heart because I ran into it 30 years ago or 25 or something. And it just really struck me, it really stuck with me. And I never, until now, I've never really thoroughly studied this book. So it's not like I read the whole thing through and I like the Nanda one. I think I just opened it at random or something, That's a mysterious thing when that happens. I have several stories about opening books at random and go, right? Tim! And it stuck with me. And then some years later, when I was really working closely with my teacher, Norman Fisher, he encouraged me to really take it up. He said, since you're interested in that, let's really take it up. Let's really look at it. Sit with it, breathe with it, be in it. Because it is also a koan in that sort of sense of the Japanese koan system, and they do this in Korea too. The kind of challenge of it, the entering into this story as transformative wisdom, and enacting it and experimenting with it with a teacher in that relationship, right? So in the teacher-student relationship, in the interview room, you're also enacting the play in a certain way, And most all of them are this way, teacher and student, enacting wisdom together. So I was doing that for a long time. Mostly, I'm pretty sure mostly what I would do is just bring up this word yes, Ananda's yes. Just breathe with yes, yes. And just feel the many sort of valences of yes and versions of yes, and how much I was saying yes to yes and how much I was kind of wishy-washy about yes, and how often I'm saying no to yes, right, is it yes or yes? Yeah. Why am I saying yes to it? Why? And, so there's ways you go up and down, in and out. It's an interesting and challenging kind of way to practice. And not just breathing yes to myself, and trying to do that throughout the day too, not just like when I'm in Zazen. But also really actually thinking about the story. So thought is involved here. There's some really, and Dogen would complain about this way back in the day, Thoughts included, words are included. It's how we use words and thought that is important. So I think about the story and imagine myself in the story. What would that be like? And then at the kind of peak of this, I was at our 7-day retreat at Samish Island. Registration is currently open for members, by the way, for 2025. It's been a while doing that retreat. And Sesshin, it's quiet all day, and we're practicing pretty steadily. Not 1,000 periods of Zazen. There's plenty of time we're not sitting Zazen, but a good number, We're pretty settled. Things get pretty concentrated, which can be beautiful and hard, or everything in between. There's no one way it's supposed to be, but, there's some depth there, for want of a better word. All these dualisms are big trouble, but words are what we got. And I was walking near the dining hall there in the evening, I'm pretty sure. Walking along, yes, yes. And I heard this kind of clink sound, like a little bit like a bell, but it wasn't a bell. Kind of cling, 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 cling. And I looked up, and I saw the flagpole they have there. It didn't have a flag on it, it usually doesn't. But there's like some metal hardware that you attach the flag to or something or other. Maybe you've heard this when you've been there, if you've been there. And something sort of started to shift in me. Couldn't tell what it was, but I was like, oh, it's right here, you know. Ananda and Kashyapa are right here. I didn't have thoughts like that, but you know, it's kind of that feeling, like an immediacy. And the next day I saw Norman, my teacher in Doksan. I was pretty grounded, I think, but I was also pretty excited, you know. I felt like something was shifting, like, you know, I've been on this story for a long time, and I talked to him about it a lot of times, you know. He's probably a little bored with it. And so I was talking with a certain amount of, I want to say grounded enthusiasm, but who knows, you know. And how intimate I was feeling with it, and so I was really kind of diving into it. I was so curious what was going to happen next, and where was this going to lead, and so interesting. And a couple of sentences in, I wasn't gushing. A couple of sentences in, mid-sentence. Oh, and Norman would usually start the interviews with his eyes closed. So I'm saying all this to my eyes closed teacher, sitting there silently in Zazen. I have faith he's listening, but, you know, that's the kind of conversation it was. And in the middle of one of these enthusiastic sentences about this story, his eyes flip open, and he says, "Tim!" And my goodness, what happened? Immediately I said, "Yes!" He didn't tell me to knock down the flagpole, but he did say, "Oh, that's good. Let's stop talking about that." Very sweet. That's enough already. So that's Ananda's yes in my encounter with it, yeah. And I hesitate to tell such stories because then you think, oh, I'm supposed to have an experience like that, or maybe you think, oh, I had a better one. Tim's actually not that great of a teacher after all. The comparing mind and the desiring mind bubble, more than bubble up, they rocket ship up, right? Yeah. And everyone has a different trajectory in practice, just like we have a different trajectory in life, right? We're not going to have the same experiences. And the Zen religious literature is so enthusiastic, you know. That's how I try to read it, when it's like this person after that person is popping off into awakening from this thing or that thing, and usually with a bunch of confusing words that don't make sense to us now, you know. But it's good to give space to ourselves to explore, to feel, and to take up these stories when they catch your attention, you know, to kind of trust that impulse. And we can work with stories in that way if you want to, for sure. So here's a little bit from Keizan's commentary about this story. That was pretty much my commentary. Here's this is from Keizan. First, he tells about Ananda's background and his family. He does that with all of them. I don't think it's that interesting to us. But then he tells a really interesting story, kind of a Zen-ified version of that first big meeting after Buddha dies. And in that one, Kashyapa goes into a magical cave to actually write down the teachings. So Zen is into literature, you know. And he's going in there with the other awakened students, just like in the earlier version. And Ananda tries to go in through the cave entrance, but he hits a wall. He can't get through. And the same thing, you know, he's outside and they're inside. And then Keizan says he tunes in more deeply than he ever has before to the great power of Buddha's teaching, and transforms himself into a little tiny body, I assume about the size of an ant. And he crawls through a crack and gets into the cave that way. I do enjoy poking holes in the idea any of us might have that Zen is a rational tradition. And then presumably he reconstituted himself, but the story doesn't say. Because the next part, he gets to speak. All the disciples looked at him and said, Ananda, as Buddha's servant, this is Keizan, has heard much and has broad learning. With him it is like one vessel full of water being poured into another vessel without spilling even a drop. We would like to ask Ananda to repeat those sermons of the Buddha. And Kashyapa turned to Ananda and said, the entire congregation is looking at you. They request that you ascend the seat again and proclaim the teachings. So presumably he wasn't in a little tiny ant body then. They wouldn't be able to hear him. So let's assume he's full size. And at that time Ananda guarded that which had been secretly entrusted to him by the Tathagata and accept Kashyapa's request. Guarded is interesting there. Ananda guarded that which had been secretly entrusted to him by the Tathagata and accepted Kashyapa's request. He stood, bowed at the feet of the congregation, ascended the seat, and proclaimed, Thus have I heard that one time Buddha dwelt at ... and recited all of the sagely teachings of Buddha's entire lifetime. After all this, must have been many days, Kashyapa addressed the disciples saying, Are there or are there not any deviations from what the Tathagata preached? Did that sound right to you guys? The disciples said, No, there is not a single word that deviates from what the Tathagata preached. So that's beautiful. But then Keizan goes on to say there can be trouble from being attached to the teachings. He wrote, But Ananda enjoyed hearing much, so he had yet to attain perfect awakening. Shakyamuni Buddha cultivated vigor and on account of that attained complete and perfect awakening. From this we know for sure that hearing much is an obstruction to the way. This is proof of that. Don't get too into it, in other words. Too attached to hearing much, to hearing teachings. So these talks are like a trap or something, Don't get too excited about them. And Keizan goes on, It's for this reason that the Flower Garland Sutra, Davatamsaka, says, It's like, for example, a destitute person who counts another's treasure, while himself not having half a cent. Hearing much is like this. There's a desperation to it, I guess. If you wish to adhere closely to the way, do not delight in hearing much. You should straightaway practice courageous vigor. So probably hearing much is a pretty literal translation from the Japanese. Sounds a little funny in English. So this is a little ironic to bring up because I do love study, and I know many of you do too. But maybe an encouragement to appreciate the teachings, appreciate study, but don't get lost there. Don't think the answer to your questions is there. And cultivate vigor also, both and study and practice, with practice as the central point. Just to be. Be with whatever's here, just to be. And like my little story about the case of Ananda receiving the Dharma, I'm sure I've read about Ananda and appreciated his appearance in various layers of Buddhist teachings, but I wasn't trying to figure Ananda out when I took up this little story about Ananda. I wanted to hear it, but somehow it inspired eventually in me vigor, The vigor supported by the framework of the story, our practice supported by the framework of the teachings. But it's like one of those, don't confuse the this for the that, cliches, right? Forests and trees, menus and meals, It's about the practice. And of course, Zen is wonderful at writing thousands of words about how it's not about the words. So let's just consider, and I think we'll just sit with this and not have small groups tonight. It's good to vary that a little bit. Some of us love small groups, some of us are allergic. Or just prefer not to, I came here to be quiet, now you're telling me to talk to somebody? Both are good. Let's just sit on our own here for a minute. And here's a question to ponder. If you're getting a little stiff and sore, feel free to change your posture for sure. So we know that actually the world is always calling to us, right? When do you listen? The world is always calling. When do you listen? What comes up for you if you just sit with that question for a little minute here? The world is calling, my heart is calling, the universe is calling, however you want to talk about it. Buddha is calling, God is calling. When do I actually listen? When do I hear it? When am I open? When am I here? And if you care to, totally optional, if something bubbled up that you could boil down to a couple of words, or literally mean a couple of words, what would they be, if you're willing to share that? When do you listen? When do you listen?
When there's a yes.
No! When there's a yes, that's good.
When my ego's not in the way.
When you're not in your own way, yeah.
Can I say a couple more?
No. That's enough, I think. That's enough. That's good.
Oh, my take on
No, I'm actually meant no.
Oh.
Let's see if anyone else has something to say.
Okay,
No problem.
When I'm struggling.
When you're struggling, that's when you listen, huh? Yeah. When do you listen? When are you awake? When are you there? I think for me it's when I really let myself feel my fear. So these kind of questions are life questions, right? I'm not going to answer them tonight exactly. When am I here? When am I listening? When am I present? Fully present. And maybe just asking the question is the important part, more important than answering. That is probably the true fact. Okay, so I'll be curious. I am curious to hear in more depth from Desiree and everybody later, but let's just leave it at that for now. Huh? That'd be okay? Yeah, thanks. May our intentions equally bend to every being